to FANSPLAINED, a media criticism podcast with Ryan and Em. I'm Ryan.
And I'm Em.
This week, we're continuing our deep dive exploration series into the MCU with the film that kick-started everything, 2008's Iron Man. This film is often cited as one of the most beloved of all MCU entries, and for good reason. Iron Man had plenty to prove, and just as much stacked up against it. Despite Tony Stark's place on the Avengers, the character did not have as much immediate name recognition as other Marvel heroes, such as Spider-Man, the core team of the X-Men, the Hulk, or even Captain America. The challenge was not only to create a film that might carry the company's hopes to launch a then-assumed very tall order of an interconnected franchise, but also to create a title character that audiences could connect with and subsequently easily recognize. Iron Man is, obviously, the first entry into the Marvel Cinematic Universe in terms of release, and takes its place as the third chronological film and sixth entry into our full series retrospective. Iron Man is set contemporarily, during the time of its release, which in terms of the story has become 2010 within the MCU. So it was made in 2008, but it's technically set in 2010 once they started giving everything a connected timeline.
Yeah.
Back when it was made, it didn't matter. Now it matters a lot.
It matters a lot because now they have to connect it to all these other movies, and probably because people were wanting to know, what year is this?
Yeah, exactly. This is also the first film that we've discussed so far to intentionally avoid a period setting. It only has a period setting now because this film is almost 14 years old.
God, I feel old. I literally went on the day this came out.
And now I think I did too, actually. It was a long time ago, yeah, though I don't really remember.
Because we got little Iron Man figurines for it.
Yeah, I was in college, and I think that I saw it. Yeah, because it came out over the summer, right? So I would have seen it in between, like... Yeah, I think that came out right before I finished... Or right before I started my senior year of college.
It came out right before The Dark Knight came out. And also that same summer, Tropic Thunder came out.
Yes.
It was very... And I got to see all three of those in the theater.
Big Robert Downey Jr. summer.
It was. It was a big Robert Downey Jr. summer, and it was a big summer for me actually being able to afford to go to all those movies because I was working.
May 2008, so it was right after I left school for the year, then went to go see it, and then we all came back from summer vacation and talked about it.
Yeah, I had like my first actual job, and so I was making money, and I was able to actually afford to go to the movie theaters whenever the frick I wanted to, and I got to go see Iron Man. They gave us that it was like a little tiny Micro Machine figurine.
That's so cute.
Like, I showed it to you.
Yeah, it's adorable.
And then I went to see The Dark Knight, and then Tropic Thunder. By the time I got to see Tropic Thunder, most of the theater was empty, and it was a good thing because I laughed so hard I gave myself a headache.
Oh my gosh.
It was so good, and it was absolutely, like, perfect reintroduction for people to Robert Downey Jr., honestly.
It was a good year for him.
It was.
So Iron Man's early entry into the MCU means that it was produced by Marvel Studios and released in conjunction with Paramount Pictures, much like we discussed with Captain America: The First Avenger. So basically Disney owns the rights now, but Paramount was the one that released it way back when. That's why they've reissued it a bajillion times once they bought their rights back in 2013. But they couldn't release that all by themselves back in 2008, especially when this was their first solo outing as a studio.
It's also why you see the Paramount logo at the beginning of Captain America as well.
Or at least on the older editions of it. I'm not sure if you still see it if, like, you're streaming it. I haven't actually watched it streaming. I only have my old copies, which would still have the Paramount logo on it.
I mean, you got the Blu-ray copy.
Yeah, but it's still an older one. It's like the older edition of it. I haven't bought, like, one of the new reissues or whatever.
I don't know. We'll have to look at it on streaming.
Curious to go look at it at some point. However, the story of Iron Man's production also begins much earlier than the attempt at the film we actually see, and this is the case for a lot of these early MCU movies where they got stuck in development hell for years and years and years and years before they ever actually got made, despite the fact that the rights were sold for many of them several times.
Mm-hmm.
Iron Man was, much like Marvel's other properties at the time, tossed around from licensor to licensor for years. Universal bought the rights in 1990, and that's why we used to see, like, Spider-Man at Universal Studios way back in the day when, like, Nickelodeon would, like, give you trips to Universal Studios on, like, those game shows that they had.
Like Legends of the Hidden Temple.
Yeah, and you'd always see, like, the Universal Studios ones. I almost had an opportunity to go to Universal Studios in, like, 97.
Oh, man.
And the group that I was going with, I mean, I was 7 at the time, it's not like I got to pick. But the group I went with at the time picked SeaWorld instead of Universal Studios.
Oh, God. What a bummer.
A cool aquarium experience, but this was back when,
SeaWorld
was super exploitative, and they're still super exploitative, but super exploitative, and it didn't have any of the theme parky stuff that SeaWorld has now, I think.
This was also the sweet spot of, like, 90s Universal.
Yeah, and we didn't get to go.
Yeah.
But this was, and I mean, like, you can tell because it was before Disney had anything but Disney stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But, let's see. Universal planned a low-budget attempt at a film at the time back in the early 90s, but they never acted any farther on the plans at all. And in 1996, Fox acquired the rights from Universal. This is the first time we see an earnest attempt at pre-production. Stan Lee co-wrote an early script with Jeff Vintar, which used MODOK as the primary villain, which obviously didn't happen, but now that they've made a MODOK series...
I'm just laughing at the idea of a low-budget Iron Man movie.
A low-budget Iron Man movie is probably like that old Captain America that was terrible, or some of those really, really old Fantastic Four attempts.
Can you just imagine that? But
I mean, yes, I can, because those low-budget attempts at those other things exist. Or, like, the old, like, Hulk TV show. That's the only reason that Hulk is even recognizable is because they had the old TV show.
Do you remember the 1970s Doctor Strange?
No.
TV series they tried to... Oh, my God.
No, I don't.
I need to show you that Cinema Snob episode. That's what I need to do.
In conjunction with this early attempt by Fox... Both Nicolas Cage and Tom Cruise expressed interest in playing the character of Tony Stark in 97 and 98, respectively.
It's honestly the least surprising thing about all of this, is that they would want to do that.
The Nick Cage one especially, since he tried out for Superman once, he was Ghost Rider for a while. Cruise surprises me a little bit, but I mean, this was still the 90s before Cruise had really just kind of...
blown a gasket.
Become the Tom Cruise that we know today.
I mean, I say blow a gasket in the sense that, you know, him jumping on Oprah's couch was kind of like that.
That was the moment, yeah.
I mean, he can jump on whatever couch he wants, you know. It's a couch. It's just, you know, maybe chill out a little bit.
Yeah.
Calm down.
As far as I know, they never actually attached any actor to this attempt at an Iron Man movie, though. But the script went under another rewrite attempt in 1999, and the studio even approached Quentin Tarantino to direct this film. That one is the one that absolutely blew my mind.
No, I mean, he was very popular in the 90s, and then he came back, like, in full force popularity with Kill Bill, which was essentially live-action anime. And the bride was basically, like, a comic book character. So I can see why they would tap him for, like, a comic book movie. Granted, I don't think that was a good... that was not a good pick. Because this is Iron Man. Like,
well, and this was back before we had a lot of rated R comic book movies, aside from maybe Blade. I think Blade might have been because of the subject material or whatever. But
I think Blade was the first one.
But beyond that, and like up to Deadpool, we really didn't have a lot of them. Or the old Punisher, maybe. I bet those were.
Also, technically, Blade was like the first blockbuster Marvel movie.
Yeah, it was. And then we had Spider-Man's, and then we had X-Men.
Yes.
I can't believe we forgot Spider-Man the first time we were trying to figure that out. However, by the end of 1999, despite the fact that they were trying to get Quentin Tarantino on this movie and they had like a new rewrite going on, Fox then sold the rights to New Line Cinema, citing their numerous other Marvel projects already in production. Like, we're doing so many X-Men movies, and did they do Daredevil? I think they did Daredevil.
They did Daredevil with Ben Affleck.
Was it Fox that did that, though, or was that somebody else?
I think it was Fox.
I sincerely don't remember, but...
The Derp Devil.
Yeah, they were doing so many other Marvel movies at the time. We just can't make them all, so they dropped Iron Man, of all things.
Well, I mean, it's a good thing they did.
Yeah, it's one of those stories, though, where it's like, I bet you're kicking yourselves for that now.
Oh, I'm sure they are. You guys flubbed Daredevil and Elektra, but, you said, oh, well, Iron Man just won't work.
The irony when the one guy that comes back from Daredevil is the one that makes Iron Man, and it's perfect.
That's, I think, poetic right there.
Poetic justice.
Yes.
So they sold the rights to New Line Cinema, so this is like the third licensor that they've handed Iron Man off to at this point. A new script was then written for New Line in 2000 by Ted Elliott, Terry Rossio, and Tim McCanless. And this script is really only notable because it's also the first to attempt a cameo appearance by Nick Fury to then set up a possibility of a solo film for that character down the line. Mm-hmm. So this was their first attempt at kind of feeling their way into like an interconnected thing, but not having to do it in a way where if it doesn't work out, obviously it's not going to hurt anything else.
Yeah.
New Line then approached Joss Whedon to direct this attempt at Iron Man in 2001. We almost had a Joss Whedon Iron Man.
Yeah, like you can't see my face right now, but it's like that old man from LA Noire, like...
It's one of those things, and we'll get to this when we get to the Avengers, but it's one of those things that I really wish we'd had a Favreau actually handle Avengers. I want to know what that Avengers would have looked like.
Yeah, going back and rewatching this movie, I really would have loved to see how he would have done the Avengers, honestly.
I really do, too.
God, that was... now I'm really over that.
However, because this movie was stuck in development hell... that attempt was also dropped, and then by 2004, New Line was trying another script under development, and it was being written by David Hayter. And David Hayter is famous for writing X-Men, X-Men 2, and Watchmen, but he's also the voice actor for Solid Snake.
Good.
So he like appears as a character actor in a bunch of stuff. He does a lot of voiceovers, but I find it really funny that he does all of these, like... Yeah. I assumed, the first time I heard that, I'm like... that can't be the same guy. There's no way. They just share a name. It's just a coincidence. And then I looked it up and I'm like, oh no. Snake. Solid Snake wrote X-Men and X-Men 2.
Solid Snake is a Marvel fan. It's canon.
It's
beautiful. You're welcome.
The irony of this is that when Hayter was doing his rework of the story, he was the first one to use Pepper Potts as a love interest in the story. But he also replaced the Mandarin, and this was the second villain that they'd been trying to throw around for Iron Man, because a lot of the problem with not getting one of these films off the ground was not really knowing what to do with the villain. So Hayter's script replaces the Mandarin with Howard Stark as War Machine, as the villain against Tony, so that you can have that deliberate mirror of the hero and the villain in each other.
That's still so...
It's bizarre.
It's very bizarre.
But at the same time, if they used anything from that old script for the new one, I can kind of see where they got the idea for Obadiah Stane in that a little bit, especially since he is the father figure.
Yes.
But they obviously didn't use War Machine because that's Rhodey, and you don't make War Machine a bad guy. What are you doing?
Yeah, that's where it really doesn't make sense, and you're twisting up canon to fit a really weird narrative.
I think they just liked the name of War Machine because, like, when we were watching it, I was like, yeah, that's an odd name for, like, a suit when you're sitting there going on about how you're pulling out of weapons manufacturing and you want to go for world peace or whatever, and you pick War Machine? It's an odd name for a thing, you know what I mean?
Except it ends up being, like, someone else's decision to name it that. And Rhodey
I mean, of course it is, because we'll get to that too. The way that they handle the military in this movie is interesting. So, I mean, it very obviously comes across as a military decision there, not Tony's.
But, I mean, I'm not surprised that they were trying to make the Mandarin this early on, because in that, there was a 90s Iron Man cartoon that I don't know if a lot of people remember. It was I don't even remember how I found it, really. It was when I was still watching the 90s Spider-Man, X-Men cartoons pretty regularly. They had a Fantastic Four that was very similar in the animation style. And in that cartoon, they had the Mandarin as his ultimate arch nemesis. He had really long fingernails, pointy ears, and he was green. And I remember him showing up a lot more often than I think you really expect him to in shit like this. But here, when them trying to introduce them...
You're 16 minutes in, it's okay.
Okay. Every time. I'm not really surprised that they were... I'm more surprised they were... that Stan was trying to make MODOK his villain of choice, when it's like, no, the Mandarin isn't actually that surprising, because they've paired him, parallel to the Mandarin for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And even when I was collecting graphic novels of it, he showed up quite a bit, even in the Avengers ones.
Mm-hmm. I'll get to that when we get to the writing a little bit, and why the decision was made to pull back from that again. But, so, of course, even though they have a more solid script for this, more solid attempt at things finally, this still falls through. They had a director attached to this, they had a release date attached to this, and the New Line movie just doesn't get made. It was supposed to come out in 2006, and it just didn't happen, and so the rights reverted to Marvel back in 2005, and then they turned around and used that as an opportunity to craft their own version of Iron Man from scratch. And that's how we get the Jon Favreau Iron Man. He was hired in 2006 to direct the film after having worked with Avi Arad in Daredevil, because Jon Favreau was Foggy Nelson.
He was Foggy fucking Nelson.
But the absolute irony of this is we have an actor, which I'll get to later, but we have an actor from the Iron Man movies who actually shows up in The Punisher later as a different character. So it just keeps multiplying on itself when The Punisher is deliberately attached to Daredevil within the Netflix continuity.
Oh yeah, even though The Punisher actually showed up in... the first time he showed up was in Spider-Man. Mm-hmm. Spider-Man comic books.
Mm-hmm.
But he's more closely associated with Daredevil.
It's because Marvel Spider-Man wasn't really a thing by the time they really started those Netflix shows. But it also, those Spider-Man movies have a questionable take on New York City. So I'm not particularly surprised, because the Netflix shows were very, very centered on New York City.
And they have and the Spider-Man movies in general, I think we can look at now and see that, this is actually a really messy amount of movies for one character.
Mm-hmm. It's getting into Batman territory with how convoluted that is.
Mm-hmm.
So Iron Man, once they attempted this new final Marvel Studios take on it, had a budget of $140 million and earned about $585 million over its theatrical run, which, in comparison to modern Marvel movies, that sounds like a complete flop. But back in 2008, movies didn't really make as, they weren't billion-dollar enterprises the way that they are now.
Not only that, but this was like the first Marvel movie, and it was about Iron Man.
And for a character that a lot of people did not know. Yeah. He's not Spider-Man.
Yeah, a lot of people didn't know what to really expect of this movie, so that is actually a massive success for a movie like that.
Yeah, absolutely. They made their money like 5 times over.
And they were like, oh, we have something here.
oh, we actually have a character that people recognize and like. Hooray!
Mm-hmm.
So Iron Man, as we know it, is this attempt at Marvel Studios with Favreau directing. Favreau had wanted to work with Avi Arad again after their collaboration on 2003's Daredevil, and we talked about that. The film had scripts done by 2 different writing teams, the first being Mark Fergus and Hawk Ostby, and the second being Art Markham and Matt Holloway. Favreau then took these 2 screenplays and kind of compiled them and then made changes of his own on top of that. And then there were constant script rewrites to the point where they were improvising on set all the time, which made the Marvel executives extremely nervous, especially when there was so much writing on this movie.
Yep.
But it was also notable to some of the actors, namely Jeff Bridges, who's such a seasoned actor that he comes into this and thinks that he's making a student film. He literally called it a, quote, $200 million student film.
Jeff, excuse me, you played the dude. Like, come on.
Yeah, but I'm pretty sure most of that was scripted. He basically had to tell himself to calm down because it's just a $200 million student movie.
You worked with the Coen brothers, dude. You should know how to just go with the flow by now.
Yeah, this was in an interview that he did on PBS called Actors on Actors. And he did this interview with Matthew McConaughey.
Oh, yeah, I remember them doing that. Mm-hmm. They had it. I remember one episode they had Pedro Pascal and Willem Dafoe doing it together.
Oh my god, that's beautiful.
Yes.
What a pairing.
Mm-hmm.
So Favreau not only compiled these 2 screenplays with his own changes and Robert Downey Jr.'s changes, constant Robert Downey Jr. changes, but he also got input from numerous comics creators such as Mark Millar, Brian Michael Bendis, Joe Quesada, and a bunch of other Iron Man writers, basically.
Yeah.
He claimed that his inspiration was heavy in Tom Clancy, James Bond, and RoboCop.
I mean, I can definitely see some of that in there.
He wanted a, politically ambiguous ultimate spy movie, which I find interesting because Iron Man is not at all a spy movie.
No.
So I find it funny every time we talk about this where they're like, well, we didn't want to make this a period piece, and we didn't want to do this with it. Every time they make a big overarching statement like this on a movie, it's like the opposite of what they end up doing.
Yeah.
Like, we don't want Captain America to be a period piece, except that that's exactly what it is, and that's what it's supposed to be.
It's literally the 1940s. What the fuck is wrong with you? Of course it's gonna be period.
But yeah, so they also had to use 2 different cameras often to catch, like, all of the lines that are being delivered on the fly. Mm-hmm. And then would have to do things over and over again because Robert Downey Jr. just constantly wanted to try new stuff with every take. He wouldn't do the same jokes in every take. He'd do, like, a new thing every time.
Oh, that's big Aries energy for you
Extremely. Right there. To the point where, like, he's the one who improvised the no, can we all just sit on the floor scene?
Yes.
And he's the one who basically wrote the speech that he gives at the beginning of the movie about the Jericho missiles.
Yes.
He improv'd so much of this that I feel like Robert Downey Jr. really deserves a writing credit on this film.
Yeah, and it's why when people want to credit, Kevin Feige and all that for the creation of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, I'm like, no, it's Jon Favreau and Robert Downey Jr. They're the ones who gave us the Marvel Cinematic Universe, because without them doing what they did and making this movie what it is,
it wouldn't have worked.
It would not have been the movie we got. It would not have been successful, and it would not have carried over into all of these other movies that came after it.
No, not at all. It's a very odd film.
It is, but somehow it works.
Yeah. So, in summary, Iron Man introduces us to scientist and entrepreneur Tony Stark, inheritor of Stark Industries from his equally scientific and industrious father, Howard Stark. Stark Industries is heavily involved with weapons manufacturing and military contracting, and during a weapons presentation in Afghanistan, Stark's caravan is attacked and he is captured by a mysterious organization called the Ten Rings. This will be more important later than it is in this movie. This organization has been acquiring Stark weapons through the black market, and Tony is given an ultimatum: make the 10 rings, the type of missile he'd been demonstrating for the U.S. military, or die. During the attack, Stark also suffered injury with shrapnel entering his chest, and he's required to attach an electronic magnet to his chest, basically to keep these shards from entering his heart and killing him.
Yeah.
This necessity, inspired by the caretaking of Ho Yinsen, an equally brilliant scientist and fellow captive, gives Stark the idea to use this power source to create robotic armor intended to help him and Yinsen escape captivity. Yinsen, however, makes a risky sacrifice to ensure Stark's survival, and Stark is left to battle his own guilty conscience for his involvement in weapons manufacturing, their use, and his responsibility for Yinsen's life as he arrives back home to the States. Stark has the bright idea to close the weapons arm of Stark Industries, but this move is looked upon poorly, to say the least, by Stark's mentor and longtime family friend Obadiah Stane. Stane is more interested in his stake in Stark's company than he is in Stark's conscience, bringing their seemingly paternal mentorship and friendship into conflict. Additionally, this announcement comes with the ire of the U.S. military, especially in the form of Stark's friend James Rhodes, a lieutenant in the Air Force. While the Ten Rings scrambles to recreate the armor Stark had used during his escape, Stark is confronted by reporter Christine Everhart about his continued involvement in weapons manufacturing and sales, revealing Stane's double dealing to both the U.S. military and those fighting on the other sides of various conflicts. To set things to rights, Stark goes about refining the suit of armor that had saved his life, powered, like the first, by the reactor set in his chest keeping his heart beating. But once the secret is out, what's to stop this armor, intended as a shield, from being used as the kind of weapon Stark is seeking to block? See what I did there? Shield. I'm so funny.
So funny.
I'm so funny. So Iron Man stars Robert Downey Jr. as Tony Stark, Gwyneth Paltrow as Pepper Potts, Terrence Howard as James Rhodes, Jeff Bridges as Obadiah Stane, Sean Tobe as Ho Yinsen, Ferran Tahir as Raza, who is the leader of this film's contingent of the Ten Rings, and Leslie Bibb as Christine Everhart. We also see smaller appearances and cameos from Clark Gregg in his, at the time, first appearance of Agent Phil Coulson, Jon Favreau as Happy Hogan, Paul Bettany is the voice of Jarvis, who is Tony's AI.
No doubt based on Edwin Jarvis.
Yes, based on Edwin Jarvis, who we covered in Agent Carter. And Tim Guinea as Air Force Major Allen, who returns to this role in Iron Man 2. And ironically, Guinea will also make an appearance as a very unrelated character in The Punisher Season 1 called Clay Wilson, who is also, in the comics, weirdly attached to Iron Man canon.
Yeah, I never would have... I totally did not realize that was the same actor in Punisher Season 1.
I thought I recognized him, so I looked it up, and then that's what happened.
Like, in watching this movie, I recognized his face from other things, but I did not at all connect it to the Punisher TV show.
Yeah, I didn't either up until I looked it up, and I was like, who's Clay Wilson? And then looked it up, and I'm like, oh! Okay! So, yeah, completely unrelated. It's a lot like, you know, Enver, like, showing up in Avengers and then being a completely different
character in
very important character in Agent Carter, things like that. So this isn't the first time they've done this. I mean, they've even done it outside of franchise where you have, like, Chris Evans in both the old Fantastic Four and then Captain America. Or Michael B. Jordan doing the same thing where he was in a Fantastic Four attempt and then also was in Black Panther, and they both played the same role in those Fantastic Four movies.
Fan Four Stick, you mean?
Yeah.
I still can't believe you're gonna make me watch that.
I am absolutely going to make you watch it because I've never seen it.
Ugh.
So this movie, despite it not really being a super familiar one for a lot of people, also has a slew of cameos back before Marvel was even really super into cameos. This one is still chock full of them.
Yes.
So cameo appearances also include Stan Lee as himself. It's one of the few cameos that don't give Lee a character for his quick movie appearance. He's actually just himself. Tony just mistakes him for Hugh Hefner.
Yes.
But this one, Captain Marvel, and I'm sure there are a few others where he's actually just Stan Lee, but those two are the ones that I remember off the top of my head where he's literally just Stan Lee. He's not just a background guy.
A background character.
Jim Cramer of Mad Money as himself. Rapper Ghostface Killah was meant to appear in a scene in Dubai where Tony's staying in a hotel, but the scene was ultimately cut for pacing issues.
I remember seeing that clip where he's like with the models and he like takes his...
Yeah. Well, and Ghostface Killah was actually known as using Iron Man as an alias. It was also his first album title was named Iron Man. So this is why they actually gave him the cameo, but they ended up cutting it later. Tom Morello of Rage Against the Machine, he's one of the 10 Rings guards early on. The funniest part of this is that he did guitar composing for the composer. And that's why he ended up getting a cameo, is because some of his guitar work is actually in the soundtrack.
Good.
So we have him in there. Will Lyman is the narrator of that presentation that's at the beginning of the movie that's like summing up the biography of Tony and his dad.
Which was a very, that was a smart way of doing that, actually.
Yeah, it's a nice way to give you a bunch, like an info dump, without making it feel extremely tedious.
Yeah.
But Will Lyman is he's a common narrator for a lot of documentaries. He does like a lot of character work on like Law and Order and a lot of like crime shows and stuff like that. So I don't remember recalling anything that was like super, super huge, but he'd done a bunch of different documentaries. He's just, narration is just the thing he does. He has that good voice. Narrator guy voice.
Yeah, he has a good narrator.
The movie phone guy voice, except he's not the movie phone guy.
Narration is my passion.
Narration is my passion, indeed. As well as Peter Billingsley, who is the Stark scientist William Riva, who gets yelled at by Jeff Bridges in the Tony Stark built this in a cave with a box of scraps. So that guy...
That's Ralphie.
That is Ralphie from A Christmas Story.
I can't believe that's Ralphie.
Well, I'm not Tony Stark. That is Ralphie.
I can't believe that's Ralphie.
You're welcome.
My mind's blown by that. I had no idea that was Ralphie.
You're very, very welcome.
Living the dream, Ralphie.
Except not, because he's getting screamed at by Jeff Bridges.
But he got to be a scientist for Stark Industries. You really came up in the world, Ralphie.
A little bit. The technology doesn't exist. Yeah, just like the technology for that lamp.
Yeah, well, I'm not Tony Stark.
Yeah, that guy.
I love it.
And now the infamous appearance from Samuel L. Jackson in the post-credits scene. This was actually not intended on being a repeat performance. They didn't contract Jackson to come back as Nick Fury ever. They just originally planned this as just a one-off that would connect the films later if this movie worked out well enough. And at the time, they did not know if this movie was even going to do well enough to bother with the rest of the MCU at all. Yeah. They had like little inklings of ideas and stuff, but they really didn't know if this movie was actually going to be the seminal classic that it basically is.
Mm-hmm. They had no idea it was going to succeed like it did.
Absolutely not. There's also an alternate cut of Jackson's post-credit scene where he's like, I'd like to talk to you about the Avengers Initiative. There's an alternate scene that they obviously cut for legal reasons, where he's mentioning gamma radiation, radioactive spiders, and mutants. Oh so he literally references Spider-Man and the X-Men in all but name, and they had to cut this, obviously, because they did not have rights to Spider-Man at the time, nor did they have rights to any mutants at all.
Nope.
At the time. You also have Favreau really fighting for Robert Downey Jr.'s involvement in this movie. So originally, because Jon Favreau was bringing in a lot of people he's worked with before, because he's done a lot of stuff, and he'd done quite a bit up to this that I actually didn't know that he'd done a ton of like directing work and stuff prior to Iron Man.
This movie was the first time I had ever known Jon Favreau was a director.
Yeah, I'd always known him as like a character actor. Yeah. But he'd done work prior to that, and like he brought in a cinematographer he's worked with, or he brought the cinematographer for this movie back for other things afterward. He hadn't worked with them before, but he brought him back afterward. But initially, Favreau wanted to tap Sam Rockwell to play Tony Stark. And this was before he'd gotten Robert Downey Jr.'s screen test. And basically, the minute he got Robert Downey Jr.'s screen test, he's like, I want this, and I don't want anything else. You cannot convince me I want anything else. And even though the studio kept pushing back on it, because Robert Downey Jr. did not have the best of reputations at the time.
No. His reputation, and the stuff that he basically went through before Iron Man, like, by the time he got to Iron Man, he was still trying to claw his way back to being a respected actor. He had nearly obliterated his acting career with the stuff that was going down. But again, that's part of what made him perfect for Tony Stark. He understood all of that stuff. He understood that kind of mindset. He understood that whole demeanor. And you can definitely see that in his performance.
Well, and that's part of why Favreau wanted him so much, is because he was Tony Stark. He knew exactly how to play Tony Stark. And I feel like this is why Robert Downey Jr. was so into just improving all of it and letting it come organically. Because he knew this. He didn't need a script for this. He knew what he was doing.
Yeah, he knew this character before he even decided to play Iron Man.
So, poor Sam Rockwell misses out. But then we bring Sam Rockwell back as, like, the main antagonist of Iron Man 2. So he doesn't miss out entirely. Favreau does bring him back because Favreau also does Iron Man 2.
Well, look, he ended up... I think he actually did get an Oscar eventually for 3 Billboards Outside of Ebbing, Missouri. So, you know,
Rockwell did?
Yeah. So, I mean, he did miss out on playing Tony Stark, but, you know, he has a pretty good acting career himself. I think he's fine. I think he got over it.
I think they made the better decision here, because and I don't want to get into that right now because then I won't have anything to talk about next week with Iron Man 2. But I think they made the better decision.
Yes, because this is essentially Robert Downey Jr.'s Rising Phoenix moment. Because before this, he had done Gothica, which did not do very well. He was, you know, like I said, he was trying to work his way back into actually getting roles. Because I honestly hadn't... I mean, of course I was young. I hadn't paid attention to any of his stuff growing up.
I hadn't either.
It wasn't until this movie that I sat up and started taking notice of him. And it's because this was essentially his huge comeback into acting. And without this movie, I don't think he probably would have had it like this, or even close to it.
There's also other weird little bits like this with some of the other actors, namely Terrence Howard, who ended up playing Rhodes in this movie. He ended up playing Rhodey in this movie, but they originally tapped Don Cheadle for this. I do not know why Don Cheadle couldn't come for this movie. I assume it's kind of like Thor, where they originally wanted Zach Levi, but couldn't get Zach Levi, so they got the other guy, and then they got Zach Levi later.
Yeah.
I assume it had something to do with scheduling conflicts or whatever.
Probably.
So they originally wanted Don Cheadle, didn't happen, so they used Terrence Howard, and then Don Cheadle ends up playing Rhodey from every film after this onward.
Yeah, because I think there was some sort of argument or conflict with Howard wanting, like, a bigger pay or contract or something.
Allegedly, don't cite us on this, because I have no proof for this. I didn't look it up.
Allegedly. I don't remember if it's true or not.
Allegedly.
I just remember that something went down and they used that as an excuse to usher Don in, and I mean, I kind of prefer his Rhodey, actually.
I agree. So, also, with Jeff Bridges, when they hired him, I'm not even sure that they really knew which villain they wanted to hire him for. They just decided they wanted Jeff Bridges.
We want Jeff Bridges.
Because Favreau has gone on saying that he did not want to do the Mandarin because he felt the Mandarin was basically too hokey. And it wasn't going to be a very good movie. You had to, like, do it in a sequel, and you were going to have to tone change it, and we'll get to why when we get to why. But he didn't feel like the Mandarin could really be a really good, like, intro villain to Tony Stark, basically. So he didn't want to do that. But Obadiah Stane was actually planned to be the villain in the sequel. He was not actually initially planned to be the villain of this film. Up until they basically hired Jeff Bridges, and they're like, yes, this.
Yeah, no, I'm glad they went with Obadiah Stane because, yeah, he only shows up once, but he's pretty darn good as a villain in this.
It's one of those few movies that establishes the villain in that single movie and it doesn't feel underused. They feel like a full character.
Yeah.
This is unfortunately an issue with a lot of Marvel origin movies.
Like
there are a few of them where the villains just really just kind of whiff it.
It's forgettable. They are forgettable. This does not.
This is not one of them.
No, he feels very much like he is a part of Tony's life. He feels, like you said, fully fleshed out. You understand his motivation. I remember actually watching this the first time, and I did not anticipate him
being the bad guy.
No. I remembered the whole theater was like, at that reveal, and I was I was with him. Because, I mean, he's Jeff Bridges. You don't expect to see him as a villain. Though this is not his first time playing a villain, and I'm not gonna spoil which movies for that, even though they are technically, like, from the 80s. But still, don't want to spoil him. He has played villains before, and he does it pretty well, honestly.
Is there anything else you want to go over with the acting with anybody else?
I really loved Jensen.
He's so cute.
I loved him just giving Tony such a hard time, but he clearly made such an impression on him. Mm-hmm. And a good one.
I feel like that was also a side character that actually had a pretty robust character for how little he's in it.
Yeah, he really did, and he had, like, a big impact. And going back and rewatching it, his death, his little arc still made us...
It's still really upsetting.
It's incredibly upsetting. Because you really care about this guy that you barely know, but, like, for the few minutes he's there on screen, you do not forget him.
Oh, no. No. I would argue that Tony's PTSD that shows up later in the story, not in this film, in subsequent films, I would argue that this should be what that motivation is, even if it's not necessarily what they show that motivation as being. I feel like it should be that, because that is the emotional crux of this film.
Yeah.
Kind of like Avengers has an emotional crux that's similar to this. I'll go over that when we get to Avengers, obviously.
Yeah.
I feel like this one's far more effective.
Yeah, I do. I feel like this whole thing is it just... I'm trying to find the right words to say it, but his death carries far more emotional weight for Tony as a character. I feel like his whole time spent in that cave is where his PTSD should come from, because that whole situation was horribly traumatic.
Exactly.
It would be for anybody. But that should be where his PTSD comes from, combined with the survivor's guilt of this guy that he knew and he grew to care about, and actually taught him so much about himself and what he needed to do with his life, and yet he couldn't save him.
Yeah, well...
And I actually, you know what? I feel like that might be what Robert Downey Jr. was trying to do in all the later movies where Tony becomes obsessed with protecting.
Oh, I'm sure it is. Yeah. I think that's part of it. The writing itself just never quite gets there to explain it to you.
The writing never does it well, but I think that might be what Robert Downey Jr. has been doing the whole time, is that he gets this way because he could not save Jensen, and that guilt from that, he still carries it deep inside of him, and he's like, no, I never want to fail someone like that again. I never want to lose someone like that again. I want to be able to protect the people that I care about. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they do this in this film, at least, because you have them bring back up Jensen's village deliberately. Yeah. That's part of the reveal with Christine that sets Tony off.
Yes.
And I did appreciate that. I just don't necessarily appreciate later films almost sometimes acting like this one didn't happen.
Yeah.
Or it did happen, but none of it really matters anymore, when this is Jensen is like Tony's Uncle Ben.
Pretty much.
This is his emotional call to action moment. Mm-hmm. He would not be Iron Man if this shit had not happened. Mm-hmm. Not at all.
No.
So... yeah, kudos to him, for sure. Mm-hmm.
And, yeah, I mean, it goes without saying Robert Downey Jr. is the person in this movie.
Yeah, there would not be a Tony Stark if it was not RDJ. I feel like it would be a completely different movie and probably suffer for it as a result.
I feel like the reason it was so successful was purely because of his charisma and everything he brought to the character. Because, yeah, the character is very funny. You can't wait to see what dumb thing he's going to do next.
Mm-hmm.
You also get to see someone who doesn't really have superpowers, but he has an incredibly superpowered brain.
Yes.
You get to see a guy use his intelligence as his superpowers, and that was very cool to see.
Mm-hmm.
But I also just love the emotionality Robert Downey Jr. has always brought to Tony Stark.
Mm-hmm. Even when the films don't necessarily give a lot of room within the story for him to do that.
He always manages to still have an emotional core with that character, even when the script doesn't call for it.
And even when they're making story decisions I don't like.
Yes. You still end up seeing these moments with Tony where it's like, oh yeah, that's why I care about this character so much. And now we're going into, the cinematography, which, again, is one of the strongest points of this film, because you actually have lighting and you have color.
Yeah, they haven't developed house style yet.
Nope, they have not. Like most of the things we've looked at to this point, Iron Man is effective both as a franchise vehicle and a standalone experience. Cinematography was done by Matthew
Libatique is how I assumed I'd say that.
Okay, well, we're sorry if we butcher anybody's names.
Yeah.
Previous work includes Requiem for a Dream, Gothica, and The Fountain, a frequent collaborator with Darren Aronofsky. Libatique also served as cinematographer on Black Swan, earning him an Oscar nom, which was rightly deserved. That was a very, very good movie.
As much as I have a contentious relationship with Darren Aronofsky.
Well, basically, Black Swan owes all of its credit and infamy to Perfect Blue by Satoshi Kon, the great and late Satoshi Kon. You're welcome, Aronofsky. Pi, Noah, and Mother.
Yeah, we don't talk about Mother.
We don't talk about Mother in this dojo. He also served as cinematographer on other Favreau projects, such as Iron Man 2 and Cowboys and Aliens. Speaking of Bond, you had Daniel Craig in that one.
Yeah, Favreau liked this guy so much that he just kept bringing him back.
Well, I mean, he doesn't do a terrible job. It's just...
No.
Sometimes he's on questionable projects due to the directors. Not him. Not him. His talent is undeniable.
Mm-hmm.
He also did work on the 2018's Venom, 2020's Birds of Prey, and was nominated for another Academy Award for A Star is Born, which had Bradley Cooper, who does Rocket.
Yeah, I feel like at this point, they've ruined 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon. Marvel has just ruined it, because if you're an actor with any kind of notability for long enough, you're gonna end up in the MCU or directly related to it.
Yep. You pretty much are. Like, I'm just waiting to see who else is gonna show up in the MCU, and from what.
Yeah, they originally wanted an unknown actor for Tony Stark up until they got Robert Downey Jr.'s stuff, but at that same time, if he's trying to reestablish his career, he's as good as an unknown actor at that point.
Yeah, he was basically playing the comeback game.
Mm-hmm.
And he needed someone to take a chance on him and give him this chance, and that's what he did. He knocked it out of the park.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of color in this movie. The production design actually ends up being almost like a horror movie in some respects. It is sometimes filmed a lot like a horror movie, which makes me really want a Favreau horror movie.
God, I wish you would.
I really want one. But I also really want to know what Avengers would have looked like if it had been Favreau's movie.
I really want that now. God. I'm so mad that I can't have it.
Well, and they hadn't really created house style yet because it was their first film. I feel like a lot of them end up kind of imitating this one, especially the way that they film, like, the Air Force bases.
Yes.
Especially that.
Mm-hmm.
So they made a bunch of changes to the story. We've already talked about how they changed the villain like 15 times to try and find one that worked. They also changed Tony Stark's origin from Vietnam to Afghanistan to make it more contemporary, because Favreau said that he did not want a period movie, and they actually meant it this time.
Yeah, they meant it this time.
Whether or not you have problems with how they handle that at the time, I can give people that leeway, honestly, because it was 2008. This movie was still written in the middle of, like, the Bush-era war.
Yeah.
It didn't come out until Obama's election year, but they tried to make it as ambiguous as they could, fine. And I do appreciate that they really tried to separate the 10 rings from being just straight up Al-Qaeda.
Yeah.
Because this could have gone a lot harder into that, and it does have some almost white saviory moments, but at the same time, Tony kind of subverts that at the last minute because he leaves the bad guys there for everyone to deal with after he beats the crap out of them.
Yeah,
it's not his decision to decide what to do with them. It's the people who live there and the people who'd been affected the most by this.
Yeah. And also because that was Jensen's village, and I feel like the main reason he went to that specific one was, because he had that
emotional connection,
yeah. I mean, I feel like, they could have done it a lot worse than they did. I think they handled it about as well as you could during that time.
Yeah, it's one of those where it's always going to be uncomfortable, especially when we were still in the middle of that war for years. We didn't even start pulling people out until,
last
2020, last year?
Yeah.
Something like that. Like, that war went on for way too long. So even 7 years after the fact, it's still going to feel a little too close to home because it's not over.
Yeah.
Whereas Vietnam would have felt a little separated from that, but the actual irony of moving that from Vietnam when this came out the same year as Tropic Thunder, which was a Vietnam movie.
Yeah, it was a parody of Vietnam movies.
I'm glad that they made that change.
Mm-hmm.
I absolutely would accept critique from people who are a little more educated on the subject than I am.
Mm-hmm.
For those certain things, I can see where there would be critique of how it handles the Middle East. I can see how there would be critique of how it handles some of the hero moments in it. But I do feel like they at least tried not to make Tony, at this point in this movie, they tried not to make him just like this perfect guy who comes in and fixes everything, whatever. Because he doesn't really.
No. For the most part, he kind of keeps it about his company and not about, I'm gonna, bring peace to the Middle East.
Yeah, once he comes back to the States, he really only goes over there once more. The only other time we really see anybody going back over there is when Obadiah is, like, doing shady weapons deals with people.
Mm-hmm.
But at that point, comics fans are going to know that the 10 Rings is the 10 Rings, whereas people who aren't as initiated in that are probably just going to associate it with just some random organization or whatever, we don't know, but it will become important later. Thank God that they got to make a cinematic universe and make that important later.
Yeah.
And flesh that out to a point where it isn't a comical organization that's just a stand-in for rando terrorists.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there were things in it that I appreciate that they did. I do recognize that there are things in it that they did that I may not be wholly educated to speak on. Fair. They also moved the setting from New York City to Malibu because Favreau had thought that too many superhero movies had done New York basically to death, that he'd wanted to move it back to California.
He's not wrong.
He's not wrong, but ironically, the MCU will always come back to New York.
New York.
Like, there are very few things that continue to get set in California or move back over to California, aside from, like, this, and Agent Carter, and this directly connects it to season 2 of Agent Carter, and I feel like that's part of why they made that change as well, is so that they have the Starks set in California.
Yep.
Not that they're not rich enough to own houses wherever in the hell they want to own houses.
Yeah, I think
to be fair.
Yeah, I think Howard owned properties in multiple places at that point.
So, ironically also, with how much we brought up Howard Hughes with Agent Carter and Captain America, they were actually trying to imitate Howard Hughes in Agent Carter Season 2 because Howard Hughes did actually own sound stages in Los Angeles for a little while, and they actually filmed parts of Iron Man creating Mark III Iron Man and maybe other parts of the movie, but notably that part. They actually filmed that on those sound stages that used to be owned by Howard Hughes.
Nice.
Considering that was such a fundamental part of that comic character at the time. I still feel like there's a lot of Walt Disney in it once Disney gets a hold of it. I still think it. You will never make me not think it, especially when you have a guy who made The Rocketeer, where he really comes off as Walt Disney.
I mean, I think it's also incredibly funny that you're saying there's a lot of Walt Disney when all of this stuff was happening before Disney got a hold of Marvel.
I know, but I still think it. I still think, especially when we get to Iron Man 2, and we'll get to that. I'm not going to get to it in this one, but I still think it. But it's supposed to be Howard Hughes. And they filmed this in, like, the sound stage was actually the same general location where they'd created the Hughes H-4 Hercules, which is like a big flying boat.
Yes.
So the proto thing we see in Avengers, what do they call that? The helicarrier?
I think it is the helicarrier.
Yeah, I mean, it's not, because it's a big airplane that just floats on water, but I feel like it's...
Airship.
It's how we eventually get to things like the helicarrier existing, quote-unquote existing.
I mean, I'm sure we'll get the name in the Avengers. Oh god, I can never remember that.
I think it's the helicarrier, and the H-4 Hercules was known as the Spruce Goose. That's what it was named.
Yes.
And it only ever flew once. They didn't finish it in time for World War II.
Yeah, there was actually one very well-known time where Howard Hughes spent all this money on a plane, started flying it, and literally crashed it through a neighborhood.
Oh my god.
And it was spectacularly horrible.
I mean, I feel like we see a lot of that in Agent Carter.
Yeah. I feel like we see a lot of that with Tony just testing out his
We absolutely do. Like the falling through 3 floors back to his basement.
Except unfortunately Howard Hughes caused so much damage that it really tanked his reputation a bit when that happened.
Well, I mean, we're supposed to kind of get to some of that later. This one doesn't go as hard into that as, say, DC does.
Yeah.
DC goes real hard into that with
DC
Superman.
Really tries to, at least.
Well, they did try. If they'd stuck with the Superman storyline, they probably would have. But
an attempt was made.
I
think they tried to rush through that way too fast, honestly.
Favreau also really wanted to stick in a bunch of, like, Easter eggs for the comics people, even though, you know, they didn't know that this movie was going to do super well. Whatever, he still wanted to have certain little nods in there, which is why you get the Cap shield in Tony's workshop. Yeah. Also, the 2 airplanes that are basically flying against Tony when they mistake him for, like, an enemy jet
jets?
Or whatever.
Yeah, the jets. We watched Top Gun and you're calling them
They're planes.
Jets!
They're planes. The call signs for those jets are Whiplash 1 and Whiplash 2, and this is in reference to a Marvel Comics character named Whiplash.
Yeah. They have one.
They do that just to be a little sneaky. There are little things like that on top of, you know, like the post-credit scenes or whatever where it's intentional. Some of these things, they kind of slip in there. There's one connection that I made from this one to Guardians of the Galaxy that I'd never made before, and I'll get to it when we get to Guardians of the Galaxy because it's not important right now, but
if I remember,
kind of broke my brain a little bit.
If I remember correctly, and I could be wrong about this, but I think Whiplash was, like, instrumental to Civil War kicking off in the comic books.
I mean, it would make sense.
I think. I could be wrong. It's been ages since I've
Even though Civil War in the MCU is very, very different.
Different from the way it panned out in the comics.
Extremely different because you didn't have half the characters that made that work.
No. And also, I would argue that the comics were incredibly messy with the whole thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, there's another one where you're trying to have a political message and it kind of
gets buried under everything else.
And that happens pretty frequently with the MCU, and this one kind of gets a little bogged down in that sometimes because it's a product of its time.
Yeah.
I would really argue that this movie would not be made the same way now as it was made in 2008.
It would not.
It would come off very, very differently.
Though I will say I think it has aged better than some.
Oh, it's aged better than much.
Yeah.
Much. And a lot of them that we'll get to, even. I think that's all I really had on that. I mean, they used animatronics for the bigger suits. The one big Iron Man suit at the beginning, the scrap one, was actually one that they could fit an actor in. Usually they only would film it. That's why you see so much of it from, like, the top up, so that they didn't have to wear the legs on it all the time.
Yeah, you could definitely see where they CGI'd that suit versus when they were doing the practical.
Well, they had a stuntman fall over in it, and they were really worried that he'd, like, hurt himself, but he was fine, and the suit was fine, everything was fine. But that's why they initially designed it so that you could film it with just the top of it on, so that you could move around a little bit easier in it. Ironmonger, which is kind of what they refer to it in the film, because Jeff Bridges kind of talks about being weapons mongers at some point in the movie.
Yes.
That's what unofficially Stane's suit is called, but it's not officially said in the film. But Ironmonger was actually, like, mostly animatronic, but you can kind of see that because they had to CGI him in there, kind of like they do with, like, the Hulkbuster stuff later.
Yeah.
So that one was mostly animatronics. This, if I remember correctly, a lot of the visual effects were done by the same company that was doing the Captain America stuff. So Lola did some stuff. ILM did a lot of stuff as well to make the flying with the Iron Man look correct.
Now that I'm thinking about it, the whole Ironmonger Hulkbuster thing, there was a very similar kind of mech in District 9, actually.
Oh, was there really?
Yeah, that Sholto Copley's character had to climb into, and it's like the climax of the film, and it's
been a really long time since I've seen that.
It is one of the best scenes, I think, in the whole film, where he climbs into that mecha, the prawn mecha suit, and delivers some much-needed kick-assery. Because he's fighting against an absolute asshole of a dude. So you want him to win. But I just realized that I'm like, oh my god, the designs for those are very similar. Because he climbs in them in, like, very similar fashion.
You can also see where other films have tried to imitate the way that suit looks in other characters or other technology. And it just never quite looks right.
No. Not really.
I mean, you can see where the what if, what did they call it? Steve's Iron Man suit.
Hydro Stomper.
You can see a lot of that in it. You can see a lot of where they were trying to go with some of the Hulk movie in it. You can see a lot of how they designed Hulkbuster in it eventually. But this was the first time that they'd really made something like that work. Yeah. The fact that any of it was, like, practical effects at all is pretty impressive. Again, this had a pretty low budget because they really did not know that if this was going to do well at all. They really didn't know. They were pulling money from other sources. We talked about that with Captain America, where they were having to go through hedge funds to get money. They did not know that this movie was going to do well. So I think that it's really impressive that it does do as well as it does.
Yeah.
For a lot of the tricks that it pulls, which is why I like a lot of the horror-esque moments of it, like that shot of, like, Ironmonger's eyes, like, popping on in the dark behind
through the
Pepper.
Through the chains.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
And then the tracking shot of her running away from it. It was so good.
Tracking shots are my favorite thing in the world.
They are her favorite thing.
I love them.
It was so good.
It's perfect. Also, this film has the perfect Dutch angle in it.
Yes.
And I get so irritated. We both get really, really irritated at movies that over-abuse Dutch angles. But Favreau knows what he's doing because that...
Yes.
Or the cinematographer, or both of them. I
think both of them have to know how
They both know what they're doing. Well, I mean, the dude's been nominated for 2 Oscars
But I mean, the director has to know as much as the cinematographer has to know. Because if you abuse a Dutch angle...
It's gonna look like... There are movies...
Joss.
We'll get to that.
We will get to that.
But,
because we are absolutely those assholes that will point out during a film, correct use of a Dutch angle.
And this movie was one of them.
Yes.
That scene with Obadiah's reveal with Tony.
And ripping his heart
out. Well, his mechanical...
His chest piece.
His electronic magnet heart out. Is chilling, first off. It's still chilling.
It's very...
it's chilling even though I know it's
hard.
coming. It goes extremely hard. And again, this is one of those movies that's really violent for how mostly bloodless it is.
Top 10 anime betrayals.
Absolutely.
Right there.
Absolutely.
It was so good. Well, I forgot how good that scene was.
They didn't even need a Dutch angle for how tense that scene is with Obadiah and Pepper in Tony's office. No. Also, that scene... always has me just like
I know,
clenching because I'm like so afraid. I know nothing happens, but I am terrified by Jeff Bridges in that scene.
Every time you're like, oh god, oh yes, grab the thing. No, don't hand
run,
the paper.
Pepper, run! Oh no! Like, perfect. It's perfect.
It's so good.
It's so good. They know how to do the tense. They know how to do just the right visual cues. It's just it's good. This one has really good, like, moments in it where you can see the art, the filmmaking, the art in it. It doesn't feel like it's burdened by just trying to, like, lay extensive, just CGI and effects in it upon effects in it, upon effects in it. Like, it's a good movie.
It's one of those movies where you can definitely tell that the director himself has a passion for what he's doing, but he's not pretentious about it. Aronofsky, that's you. I'm calling you out, bro. I will call you and Joss Whedon out, bro. I will do it.
I mean, I'd call Joss Whedon out for other reasons, but again, we'll get to that. There will be plenty to get to.
Joss Whedon relies too much on other shticks to really, for me to feel like he has a passion for actual filmmaking.
We'll get to that when
Darren
we get to
Aronofsky, he gets up his own ass with his pretentiousness.
Yes.
Jon Favreau...
This is why we don't talk about Mother.
Jon Favreau, for all the kind of misses he might have had, he clearly has a passion for filmmaking. He clearly had a passion for this project, and I really appreciated a lot of what he did. This is part of why I feel like this movie has aged
really
better.
Well.
Yeah, it's aged a lot better than some of these Marvel movies, despite it being the very first one. And it's just going back to it. I keep forgetting how good it actually is.
And by all rights, it should be the one that feels the most dated, and it's really not.
It's not.
It's really not.
No.
So, moving on to the last point, which is the soundtrack. The soundtrack was actually done by Ramin Djawadi. Goddamn. We even practiced this before I said it. Ramin Djawadi.
We're sorry.
I am so sorry, Ramin.
We love your music. Okay?
Yes, we do.
This
I just
is
can't
not
speak.
We're trying.
And
okay.
My ADHD makes things very difficult. All right. He's been an Iron Man fan since childhood, and he sought the gig out himself. Favreau had tried to tap one of his friends to do the music. The guy was unavailable. I do not remember the guy's name for the life of me, but he tried to tap somebody else. Didn't work out. So Ramin sought this one out directly because he was such a fan of it. And Favreau knew that he really wanted this heavy rock kind of background music.
As you should want to.
Because Tony Stark is more of a rock star than he is a traditional hero figure. And that was how Favreau described it. So as a result, Djawadi composed the score on guitar before arranging it with an orchestra. And you can see, this isn't the first, well, I mean, it might be the first time he'd done that, but you can see that influence in a lot of his work afterward. Game of Thrones has a lot of, rock influences to it in the theme song.
Pacific Rim.
Literally
the theme for Pacific Rim that I listen to a lot has a...
But the one that's most typified for me with that is Westworld.
That's
because
huge.
It's a bunch of rock covers that he does with, like, orchestras and violins, and it's so good. I think that they even have, like, an AC/DC cover in that show.
Probably. I mean, they did do Painted Black by the Rolling Stones.
Yeah, which is the one, like, main Westworld song.
See, yours is Westworld. Mine for him is Pacific Rim.
Mm-hmm. And we both love Game of Thrones.
Yes.
So we love his work. We love his work and everything. I'm sorry that I butchered your name, even though I knew how to say it.
We constantly do the what?
Peter Dinklage.
We constantly do the theme song at each other all the time.
So funny.
So yes, big fan, huge fan of your work, mister. Keep it up. We love you. Sorry we butchered your name. Again, even after practicing
it. There were also additional arrangements done by, I already talked about the additional guitar work by Tom Morello of Rage Against the Machine and Audioslave. You also had additional arrangements and cues done by Hans Zimmer, who was like the music producer of the movie. We noticed that when we were watching the credits the other day.
Hans fucking Zimmer. And everything.
Except that, again, Zimmer is one of those that I really only remember very, very, very select things. Dune.
Yeah.
Inception.
That's the thing.
Batman. He did do Batman, right? He did Nolan Batman?
Yes.
Yeah.
He did Nolan Batman. The thing is, he has done so much stuff by now that really the only... I'm gonna say this, and I know he can probably deny it if he wants. Allegedly. My theory is that he has done so much stuff that sometimes, he phones it in. He just throws some shit together, and it's only on the films and the projects that he's really passionate about that he goes the extra distance and makes a very memorable soundtrack.
I think every creative field has those just for the paycheck projects versus the passion projects. I would argue that. I mean, I could argue that with John Williams, because after a while, every John Williams score sounds the same if it's not the early Star Wars or whatever. Like,
he did good stuff for The Force Awakens.
Yeah, but not all of it. Not all of it is memorable.
No.
I would not argue that it's on par with, like, the original trilogy Star Wars, where you remember everything.
And, like, the first Harry Potter movie.
Mm-hmm.
You have Jaws.
Yeah, there are ones that you remember, but there is also a lot of stuff that sounds extremely similar, and you don't remember it that much.
I would argue that Hook is a very underrated and underappreciated soundtrack score that he did. I love that score. Okay, you can't change my mind on that. I think he did great on that score.
That's fine. I'm just saying that I think every creative field, whether it's writing or directing or composing or whatever, I think everybody has their kind of paycheck gigs and their passion gigs.
Yes.
And I feel that Zimmer definitely has those.
And you can definitely tell. I'm just saying I feel like you can tell when those are.
Oh, for sure, for sure.
I'm sorry, this is what my ADHD does. I go on tangents like this.
No, it's totally okay. So, knowing how you've rated everything else so far, Cap was at a
5-star for Iron Man.
5-star for Iron Man.
Damn right.
5-star for Iron Man for me too. It's
damn
perfect.
Right.
It's perfect.
I love it. I still love it. After all these years, I still get the same excitement for it. All the jokes, all the comedy still lands.
It's still good. It still makes me feel incredibly intimidated. It still freaks me out, even though I know everything's coming. Like, if you can manage to do those things, it's a damn good movie.
And not only that, but by the very end, I'm excited for what comes next. And that is what you want in a movie like this. Mm-hmm. Okay, there's so many movies in the Marvel Cinematic Universe now that are literally made just to set up another movies. Mm-hmm. This movie not only set up the whole thing,
but stands on its own on top of it.
Yeah. Like, I could literally just rewatch this movie by itself.
Yeah.
And it would be fine.
Yeah.
As a standalone.
It's perfect.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of the early ones can stand on their own for the most part. There are little things that you're going to appreciate more if you know what's going on, but at least a lot of the earlier Phase 1 movies, you can generally watch them as their own movies.
This one is one of those movies where I feel like you don't actually need to know a lot about the MCU as a whole in order to really appreciate it.
This one and Captain America, I think both are pretty on par on that regard. Some of the other Phase 1s are not quite there. I feel like Thor really works better in the context of Marvel than it does by itself.
Yeah, no.
But again, we'll get to that when we do Thor. So
well, I don't know. My opinion might change later when
once we watch it.
Yeah, it's been a while.
I mean, I still love it. That's not.
I still think Kenneth Branagh did a very good job with his first comic book movie. Honestly.
This is not me shading on Thor. I love Thor.
She does love Thor.
I had a Zachary Levi Fandral poster on my wall since 2013 when The Dark World came out, and nobody liked The Dark World. So I love Thor. This is not me ragging on Thor. I just feel like it works better in context.
I hate The Dark World.
Everyone hates The Dark World.
Except you. Except you, apparently.
My relationship with The Dark World is very complicated.
Hashtag complicated.
It's very love-hate. But that is not this episode.
Not this episode.
I love this movie. This movie's still perfect. 5 out of 5 for me.
Yes.
There are very few Marvel movies that really hit this point for me, and this one is one of them.
I remember doing a big, massive Marvel rewatch before Endgame came out, and I went through all of them, in release order. Not chronologically like we're doing right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I went back and looked through the list after I had, done it all, and I marked down which ones that, this is a movie that I can absolutely watch again. I don't have to watch any of the movies leading up to it. I can just watch it on its own because I enjoy it that much. And Iron Man, this one, was one of the ones I picked. And there were very few. Actually, I was surprised at how few there were that I could actually mark down as that. But Iron Man 1 is one of them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Love it. So, thanks for listening to this episode of FANSPLAINED. If you enjoy what we do, consider donating on Ko-fi. Everything we make goes right back into the production quality of the show. We appreciate all of our subscribers and everything you do, and we're thankful for anything from Hulk smashing that like button to questions and comments on each episode, especially sharing the show with your friends. FANSPLAINED is a weekly media criticism and deep dive podcast, and we are still currently working our way through the chronological order of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Next week, we'll be looking at Iron Man 2.
Oh boy.
You can find our updates here on YouTube, as well as on Twitter and Ko-fi at FANSPLAINED. If you want more of our conversations on the MCU and other fandoms, subscribe to our channel and hit the bell for new episode notifications. Until next time, Salt Shakers, this has been Ryan
and Em
with the FANSPLAINED podcast. See you next week.